could have a certain Saturday where it seems like that's the busiest time of the weekend. It could depend on the weather. It could depend on what's happening in the community. But Nick's used some analysis kind of in the region to come up with that judgment.
Yeah, that's great. That's helpful.
I just had a question about that, the language in the ITE 210 about the local residents. Is that exactly how ITE 210 is defined in the document, or is that like where did that language come from?
Yeah, I don't believe so. Nick, could you comment on that?
Or if it's in your presentation, fine, I can wait.
No. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Nick Foster with Kittleson down in Boise. No, that language is not. I think that might actually have been carried over from the previous example that was modified. But the 210 is your standard single family home, generally in a suburban city environment. So yeah, typically owner occupied or long term rental. Most of the studies were conducted a while ago for it. It's one of the more established land uses in the trip generation manual.
I think what we were trying to do is differentiate between a vacation home that someone may be there only a few months out of the year or a few weeks out of the year versus a vacation rental where it may be used Friday through Sunday every week during the peak season versus a local resident who's there 24/7, 365, going to the grocery store, going to work, and the trip generations that occur with that type of use. And as we discussed this as a group, we're like, well, this is certainly not saying what we're going to use. That's where the scoping meeting comes in. And we sit down and we say, okay, well, what's the mix? What do we expect the mix of this development to be? We know our community is 70% second homes. So to assume that 100% of those homes are going to be locals is probably naive, right? Mm-hmm. And so we're becoming aware of that. Now, we're not specifying every single family subdivision must use 70% second homes, but to the point that some of the public has made, we need to be thoughtful about the selection of these codes and really whittle down which one's correct. If we know that we anticipate that we're going to have certain homes that won't be deed restricted to not have vacation rentals, we may be more thoughtful and say, well, let's assume some of those will be vacation rentals. And then the question is there an appropriate code that's different from single family residential, which generally has a bit of a higher traffic count? So lots of things to evaluate. This document's, again, not telling us what we should do. It's telling us we should be thoughtful when we get in that scoping meeting and use professional guidance from both the developer's engineering team as well as our engineering team.
Yeah, exactly.
Is that kind of the approach, Nick?
Yep. Yeah. I think Nathan's earlier comment about, there's an art and not all science to this, I think is completely appropriate. And as well as the public comment earlier about how we still need to have people involved in these discussions. It's very much the case with these studies. Yeah, traffic engineering is not where you go if you want certainty and to be able to just run calculations all the time. There's a human element, there's individual development elements all to it. And so, yeah, there's going to be some variability. You might look at a development and you may apply, percentages of certain codes to it, just depending on what you feel is most appropriate. So we'll continue on with this, single family home subdivision example. It's entirely possible you apply some percentage of it is one land use code, some percentage of it is another, based on what you see and are experiencing and are expecting to have happen in the future. It's not an all or nothing thing. But again, it's always decided individually through the scoping process in conjunction between, the development team and the city's staff, who ultimately are the ones that have to sign off and say, we agree on the scope for this development. We think this is appropriate.
I have a question. I look forward to the discussion at the end, but I have a question that might be, that pertains to what we have. And that is on page 9. It says the city of McCall considers the following thresholds as indicators for potential mitigation. And the level of service says below D. I'm just wondering semantically, does below D mean F, or does below D mean D and F? And so, and even as such, if we were to look at below D, I wonder if we were to say below C, that there might be, then we can look at some minor mitigation. But if it's D and below, you have to hit a pretty low threshold before you can talk to the developer's team about mitigation. So that's just that's kind of semantics.
Yeah, I want Nick to answer this, but don't think about it as your score in school.
As your score in what?
In school, when you get a D in school, you know, that's not good, right?
Yeah.
The scores in transportation analysis don't follow that that philosophy.
Okay, great.
Now that's not to say D is good. It's just saying that that's a threshold that's industry understood to be unacceptable, right?
Okay, then I like that one. But then I go to pure semantics. You say below D, does that mean F? Because it should maybe say that at D and below. So at D level,
Sure.
you get to do some mitigation. Otherwise, pure semantics, it means you have to be below D, which is only F.
There's an E and an F.
There's an E.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's an E in there too.
You should say, simply say D and below. If you want to have mitigation at D. Because right now it says you don't have mitigation at D. Okay, that's just semantics, but
Nick,
And getting back to the art versus science, I would love to tell you that we have the D, E, F, A, B, C, D scale was like well researched, and something magic happens each time you hit one of these thresholds. But it was kind of, you know, some experts put it together a while ago based on their judgment, and it's the nomenclature has stuck because it's so simple. But yeah, it's just it's tied to a number in terms of seconds of delay that would be expected. Typically, in McCall, that's almost always going to mean the seconds of delay that would be expected for someone turning onto the main street from the side street or the driveway. You know, because the people on the main street generally don't experience any delay. They're just through, no stopping. It's a little bit different at a signal. But yeah, so these thresholds, but they are convenient ways to be able to adopt. Like, okay, where are we going to start looking at mitigation? In more urban areas, F or E are typically the most commonly used ones, and we see D maybe used a little more frequently in some smaller cities or more rural areas. It's not too hard to get to. In terms of, you know, does that mean at D, you know, everyone's just backed up for miles or something like that? At D, yeah, you're looking, you know, 20 some to 30 some seconds of maybe delay at the worst, 15 minutes of the worst hour of a Friday in the summer, right? Is generally what we're talking about here. So it's a pretty extreme condition.
okay.
So for frame of reference, D is like making a left turn at Fog Lifter.
Yes.
Going straight at Fog Lifter this time.
You're waiting
Junction.
30 or more seconds.
Yeah, okay.
And it's one of the fun takeaways from this is to challenge yourself and wait 30 seconds. And we're not used to that in McCall. So,
We are at that intersection.
but we are at that intersection. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good example. And obviously it's worse during the summer, during the worst periods, and that's why it's restricted now to the right turn only. And you shift people over to where they can more easily make those movements. Yeah.
This is just, I just have one more question, and I don't know if how this is related. It's just sort of a general, maybe esoteric question, but like, you know, we're trying to, I think we're all interested in increasing pedestrian and bike access, and especially during times where it is really busy in the summer. Does that factor in at all? Because I mean, if you have more people crossing the roads, especially downtown, at that intersection at Foglifter or at May Hardware or whatever, how does that factor into a traffic analysis and this issue of level of service? Because I mean, pedestrians take a little long to cross the road, and sometimes there's just strings of pedestrians and that kind of thing. And is that even a consideration? Or
I do not know the answer to that. I've been asking Forox and Kittleson and those that do this to help guide us. Nick, I think the question is framed, and we're really kind of down in the weeds on this one, but if you're trying to model or identify mitigation requirements for an intersection such as, say, let's just say Park Street at May Hardware, right? The traffic counts, but then you also have to account for a variety of interactions where pedestrians are stopping traffic as well. Is there a way that you can incorporate that into your analysis?
Yeah, the analysis models do include pedestrian crossings. So, some places they just don't do it and they leave it out. But in here, it would be required. You do head bike counts, and you have the number of crossings in there too. And that's usually how it's done. Yeah.
On page 8, 7.5, it talks about transit services, pedestrian infrastructure, bicycle infrastructure as part of what the TIA needs to look at.
Right. And then the question is, how do you do it? Right.
Yeah.
And do you establish in that scoping meeting, if you're going to do traffic counts, do you also then need to do pedestrian counts? And so that might be additional data collection that the developers engineering team would do coming out of that scoping meeting.
Right.
And if they didn't, then they would be less positioned to argue one way or the other. So data is always beneficial to answering these questions that the public and the council has. Mm-hmm. That comes with cost. And so the typical conversation is, can we just use last year's data from this other development, right? And the initial, the playbook is, let's try to give as little information as possible, because then we don't have to prove that there's a problem. And so this guideline is basically saying you have to provide a minimum level of analysis. And then the scoping meeting allows an opportunity for the two teams to agree on what that minimum level is. And that decision is certainly up for scrutiny through the public hearing process. So.
Well, and I like what's going on here and what you're doing because, there are people involved on the city level that understand the nuances of these areas and can immediately say, okay, we have somebody that's proposing a new development at such and such a location, and we already know, well, there are pedestrian conflicts, for instance. Any new development on the east side of town is going to create an issue at Lenora or Park Street so we already know that up front. But if this document and having this in place, what happens at some point in time where we hire a new city engineer or a new public works director who haven't lived here for 20 years or haven't been here for a long time, that don't instantly know that these are already factors that we are putting this in place so that somebody that might be newer would be looking at, we need to do these things. Because all of us in this room kind of know how things go, and we already are tipped off to that. Somebody else might not realize that if there were a new development that were going to affect Dionhard and Spring Mountain Boulevard, there's actually a lot of kids that are walking down that street.
And Mike, that's part of the purpose and goal of the Transportation Master Plan, is to identify those areas at a high level and say, these are areas of concern in our community. And so part of this rewrite that you guys, authorized us to move forward with yesterday, should identify that. So when a new consultant or a new engineer comes in, they're looking at that master plan. They're taking that into consideration when they're looking at this development.
Yeah. So good job, you guys.
Yeah, okay, so to keep us rolling.
this also doesn't, remove the public comment portion of every development application too, right? And so there's still that opportunity for you all on the council or for members of the public to also highlight things that maybe your new city engineer, isn't aware of.
And it doesn't remove the actual criteria of the land use application. I think, to me, the really powerful thing about having a baseline for data, be it about the bike ped experience or the driver's experience or defining access analysis in the way that we want to see it, is that once I get that to the Planning and Zoning Commission and they have these very subjective criteria about how does it fit into the community character, does it support health, safety, and general welfare, they'll have statements and data and actual evidence to point to say this is not good enough. How do you want to fix it? Show me that you want to fix it because you need to fix it. Right now, they're like, it's not really a problem because I haven't defined it in data and objective statements and analysis. And we go, but I think there's a problem. So I think this builds a bridge between, yes, there's actually a problem and you need to solve it.
Perfect. Yeah, well said.
And again, getting back to the real purpose is to say developments of this size must do an enhanced level, and developments of a size less than that do not. Right now, it's completely up to staff's discretion, and it's very challenging for us to defend that because a savvy developer will say, "Well, prove it." So we don't have that. That's why we're getting this on, and we will continue to review this and identify things that change. But I think the sooner we can get this on the books, the easier for new applicants. We can just say, well, we have to at least go through this process. It may not be the perfect process, but anyway, again, I respect your time. Nick, if you can be very quick on your presentation and then also highlight Mike's question about how do we determine the peak hour, and is there some validity in extending that peak hour beyond 6 o'clock on Friday as the public suggested?
Yeah, great. And I will be very brief because it was already a brief presentation. We've covered a lot of it already. So again, I think I just want to quickly reiterate that, what this is doing is just setting in code best practices and moving forward. It's not making all the decisions right now on how each study of each kind will be conducted, what the assumptions will be, things like that. It doesn't remove your public comment opportunities or remove your authority or the other processes that Meredith just talked about. This is really, putting guidelines in place, making sure that everyone understands when they come in, they're going to have to do a study. It's going to have to follow this process. We already talked a little bit about land use code, so I'll jump right over to the seasonality. So this is from the Idaho Transportation Department, has an automatic traffic recorder south of McCall on Highway 55. And what you're seeing here is a graph of recent data from it. Call your attention to this. The black line is Friday. And so you can see, generally speaking, all year at this point, traffic volumes on Highway 55 coming in towards to and from McCall, they're highest on a Friday, especially the month of July. So that is where, we have this year-round data. That is how we got to the Friday peak hour look. What this doesn't have in it is the actual individual hours. If you were to pull open that same data though, and I've got it open on another screen right here in a very messy raw format from ITD. But if you were to look at that same traffic recorder and to look at when are volumes peaking of people, let's be honest, coming up from Boise on a Friday afternoon, that they peak, right around 4 or 5 o'clock usually. By 6, they're on the decline. They tend to go that way. So that's where
Nick,
come up with that.
I've got a question for you, just as being the audience here. So are you saying that these numbers that you're getting are coming from this traffic counter on State Highway 55?
Yes.
So you do have hourly data. It's not shown on this graph, but you are looking at it, and the increased traffic at that counter happens between 4 and 6 o'clock?
Yes. Yeah, and I can switch my screen share here.
There you go.
It's going to be not nearly as neat as a graph, but let me flip over to that. So All right. So this is
Oh,
this
that
is
makes
this.
perfectly good sense.
Yeah, there you go. Right. Intuitive and understanding. This is engineer data presentation at its finest. This is your day of the month for July. Over here is your hour in 24-hour time. So if you look here, we'll go pick out here, particularly high numbers. So here we are, the 17th.
Zoom in slightly, would you?
Yeah. Okay. Then I lose
There you
my
go.
time. But here you go. The highest number in all these hours you're going to find on here, if you kind of skim around, it's going to be something right around here, like 902. And you can see, so this is happening, this is south of McCall down towards Donley. But you can see here in this particular case, you're seeing the peaks happen, 3, 4, 5 o'clock. And then here 1800, and here's your hour at 6. And you can see there's generally a drop off from these highest periods. It's happening by 6 o'clock.
Okay.
So, which I understand as someone who my wife is from McCall, and we go back to visit family up there a lot. And I would love to think that if I was clever and got off work at 3 o'clock and we left by 4, we'd beat traffic. But what I always find is we're right in the thick of it. So I think this data to me jives with my own lived experience. So, but yeah, so that's that. And then, within town, 4 to 6, you're also seeing some mixing with local traffic peaking with people leaving work and things like that too. Or getting out to do something else if they came up earlier. So yeah, that's how we came up with those time periods. It's also the time periods for which the traffic generation data is available. When people do these surveys, they tend to survey right around when's the highest period of traffic on the adjacent streets, because that's what people most care about. So there is specific data for 4 to 6 p.m. peak hour for most land uses.
That was be kind of my question of like, if you take the highway out of the picture, elements and town's not just the highway, would you consider a different peak hour? Like, was 4 to 6 truly the peak hour for something that might be in a place that is maybe not directly correlated to the highway?
I think the answer is yes, if you could define the exception. Meaning like if it was a sports arena and we knew that the sporting event was in the evening, you would really want to model it when the sports arena released all of its traffic. Nick, can you help answer Colby's question, which is there a situation where you wouldn't use that Friday peak?
Yeah, there might be.
And to Mike's question, would it be appropriate to use midday Saturday if we were looking at an area around a city beach or something?
Yeah, those are good questions. So yeah, generally 4 to 6 is going to be your best bet for highest traffic on the surrounding roads. And if not the highest hourly generation of that land use, one of the highest for most developments. But yeah, there will be exceptions. For instance, if you're doing a traffic study for, an expansion of other thing, something that's specific, a sports arena is a good example, or some other special event use that's going to be having a strong surge at a different time. And you want to know what's going on during that time. You could look at that, for instance, schools, Friday 4 to 6 for a school may not make as much sense, right? There's a special school peak hour we look at. And actually, usually for schools, the AM is a key one, right? Because that's when you have your commuter traffic and other things going on and people going to schools. So schools, we always look at slightly different peak hours from, say, a residential subdivision or a coffee shop or something.
I guess to not get too far in the weeds on this,
yes.
Is there something in here that allows that flexibility of considering something that's not at 4 to 6?
Yep.
Yes,
the answer is,
or maybe even an extended period or whatever.
yep, that's where in the scoping meeting, you define that. And we have that opportunity to say, hey, this isn't appropriate. We're going to expand in addition to these general periods, we're going to add to that, right? I think to Nick's point, if we're doing a school, we're certainly focusing in at that peak morning hour because we've got commuter traffic along with school traffic, right? One would say, well, what about the afternoon? Well, you've got the school traffic, but you may not have as much of the commuter traffic. I'm interested to understand, as we look at developments in and around Legacy Beach, when's the best hour, right? Because I think we probably need to get traffic counts that show, is it really 4 to 6?
Mhm.
Or is it more like 11 to 2 when everyone's trying to find a parking spot?
I would argue between 10 and 2 would probably be the busiest time in like the over.
So I think that's the opportunity in that scoping meeting to be thoughtful and to add additional components to that. And then allow the development's engineering team to say why we shouldn't, because it's a legitimate question. So if they push back and say, well, we don't think we should do that, we can hear why, and that we can document that. So that's a public record and say, okay, if we actually agreed not to do it, this is the reason. Whereas right now we don't have all of that process. We have this general expectation, and then we kind of wait to see what they give us, and then we're responding to what they give us. Now it's forcing us to get in the room in the beginning and agree on what's going to be provided.
Yeah, and I'll just add that section 6.4, it defines these as standard study periods, but it gives flexibility for the city staff to require additional periods or different periods.
Perfect.
Sometimes that comes up in the planning and zoning process, whether it's the pre-development application discussion or a project that's come through, which this always happens, and they haven't finished their engineering analysis, but they want their entitlements so that they can generate some investment so that they can fund their final engineering. And so we hear these concerns from the Planning and Zoning Commission, we hear these concerns from the public, and that helps us sometimes. If that scoping meeting hasn't happened in that environment, that we get to use that feedback as well. Ideally, all of that scoping and that transportation impact analysis is always done before the planning and zoning process. But as you know, the process isn't perfect, and it allows developers to get further down the entitlement road with the condition that they meet all these criteria. And that's never fun, but that is standard practice.
And the language that's in italics in this will stay in there. It's not just for the sake of this discussion. It's in there. It's the developer is looking at that saying city staff may require additional depending on the project.
Correct.
Yeah. So it's there up front.
Yep.
Yep. That's great.
Did you have anything left on your presentation, Nick? I think there was a graphic of level of service, wasn't there? Somewhere in there.
Oh, there might be. Yeah, let me see if I can find that one. Yeah. Sorry, I just need to pull that one up here. There we go. All right, let me get that one up now. Yeah, so this is sort of an attempt to, show what level of service might mean, in a very rough perspective. But yeah, there's your level of service D. So 35 to 55 seconds per vehicle, turning on from that side street during the worst, 15 minutes of the worst hour being studied, basically.
And my experience with these types of criteria and thresholds is that they cut both ways. Meaning, if you set the standard too high, most of your developments become cost prohibitive. We've run into a number of land use developments that are working on workforce housing over the last 2 to 4 years. St. Luke's, the school district. And if these thresholds are high enough, then that burden of mitigating to get to a level of service C, for example, then puts an extreme cost burden on those types of developments. So the level of service D is an industry standard. I think it's designed to say, okay, it's acceptable to have that amount of weight. But it does, when it really comes down to brass tacks, it kind of sets the bar at which, you know, you can still allow smaller developments to occur that are less likely to drop it below the D. Whereas larger projects would likely bring, if we have a certain condition where we're already having a problem, a larger development is going to trip it faster than a smaller development. And what we've talked about at great lengths is many of these projects are phased. And I think we've seen that, whether it's Spring Mountain Ranch or a number of different large projects, breaking it down where this traffic impact analysis is only good for the purpose of the phase that's being conducted. And if the second phase hasn't been conducted or hasn't actually been completed, when they come through to get approval for their next phase, another analysis is required because McCall may have grown and changed, and all of these things have changed as far as what are the actual conditions. And I think that's really important when we think about some of these larger planned unit developments that have been speculated. We don't want to make all of our decisions and get all of our commitments in 2025 when it may not actually get built till 2035.
Yeah. Also, if you were following along earlier and heard my numbers I said before for level of service D and saw what was on that spreadsheet or on that graphic, I wanted to clarify that graphic. Those numbers were for a signalized intersection, which has higher delay tolerances. So for your unsignalized intersections, most of what you got in McCall is that 25 to 35 seconds of delay I mentioned earlier.
And when it comes to the scoping meeting time and utilizing this tool, let's say the state sells the parcel northeast of Seaway and Pilgrim Cove and that whole area, which could be that quarter acre lots could be a huge development. Could be 400 units. That would have significant impact back at 3rd Street. So that would be something that when you're looking at, we're not just looking at the connections onto Lick Creek Road. We're looking at the connections that come all the way to the state highway. How would you envision that, just for frame of reference and for the conversation as well? These are things that probably we're all looking at, because now you have a tool that you can assess in the scoping meeting, but does it take it all the way to like the state highway? I mean, certainly my preference would be that it does.
Yeah. That is a great question. And it's a tough question because proportionality of improvements is something that we always have to keep in mind. So if we know that this development is going to cause impacts to 7 intersections from here to Ridley's, then the question is, how much can we extract from that individual developer without it being so cost burdensome? But to your point, I think we do need to ask that question of what will the impacts be. Nick, can you help elaborate on your experience and how you've navigated that? If you have a development that's on the east side of a community and there's a bottleneck in the center part of the community, how you could require that development to mitigate that center bottleneck?
Yeah, sure. And so these guidelines are not prescriptive in terms of like, you will only study intersections that are this close or that you put this much traffic through. So these are intentionally left open for the city staff to provide some judgment on what study intersections should be included. So yeah, when you are getting to a situation where you're making impacts further away, yeah, you do run into these questions of proportionality, and different jurisdictions have different ways of dealing with that. You know, if you're only adding a few trips to an intersection that already has a problem, yeah, you might run into problems trying to require that development to do the entire mitigation themselves. You know, they may be able to successfully challenge that in other ways. And so yeah, it is part of that judgment piece that city staff and have to work through, as well as with their planning commission and city council. But if you are a major development and you are, you know, adding a significant proportion of trips to an intersection that is far away, that can still be part of the process. We see that with some of the large developments down here in the valley, and we see it with larger ones sometimes further away. So
I have a good example of that. There's been a contemplated development off of West Mountain Road. And during the scoping and the transportation impact analysis, the question was asked, well, what is that impact going to have at the intersection of Dinehard and West Valley Road? And so we have that information. Now the question is, through the entitlement process, will the county obligate that developer to make that improvement? In the meetings that our staff have had with that developer, we've said, please, this will be the public comment that we provide to them, right? Our land use process allows the city council within the city limits to make those decisions. So hopefully what we can do is provide through this process that information and identify that. Then through the legal process, the question of proportionality gets vetted. And so we have to make sure that we're in good legal standing if we're going to require a developer to do something that's further away from their development and be well justified. So again, the value of getting this data is really here. Whether it will solve the community's problems is more nuanced, but at least we can get that information and then we can provide that response of, yes, this is legally feasible to require this. No, this isn't proportional. But we can get this improvement done. So it's not an absolute answer there, but the potential is there.
Because it's when we look at something like where Paika Bakery is or Idaho Water Sports and proposed developments there, they need to put in a turn lane if they want to.
Yeah.
If Idaho Water Sports wants to develop the back portion of their property, they need to put in a turn lane. Paika Bakery wants to be open to the public on a general basis, they need a turn lane. So that's directly right there at their property. And that makes sense to people. But when you talk about a development off West Mountain and the impact it's going to have to West Valley and Boydston, or we talk about the impact of a large-scale development on the east side of town, it's going to have a significant impact. So there's the ones that are right in there. That's one side of the equation. The other side is the ones where it affects something further out. And that's where the point of impact is. Yeah. So.
And that's the case at the Dinehard intersection too, right? Because it bottlenecks at the Dinehard intersection with Spring Mountain Boulevard. So we know any development that's happening out there is going to have to look at how that impacts that intersection.
Right.
Just going back to that level of service below D language, since we had two people comment while I brought that up. I mean, here, it just says is an indicator for potential mitigation. So I'm wondering if what your thoughts would be on changing that to like level of service D or below, so that gives you a little bit more flexibility to consider. Because I read below D as like E and F, but that would allow you to consider level of service D, E, and F. And potential mitigation. I mean, since it's case by case basis, of course, it may. I mean, dropping to a level of service D at certain places may not be that great, compared to maybe other places where, you're, like through downtown, you're wanting to get traffic moving and flowing and everything, and hopefully you would keep a higher level of service. But also I'm thinking in terms of potential mitigation, for bike and pedestrian safety, because the more traffic you have standing around or moving through an area, the less safe it is for alternative modes of transportation. And so, I mean, the language here is an indicator for potential mitigation, certainly isn't requiring you to mitigate, if it drops below a certain level. But I'm just wondering if we just raise that bar a little bit, that gives you the city a little bit of flexibility to consider mitigation for that level.
It's a good question. One of the things that we also need to keep in mind is, what does mitigation do? So if you raise the bar, now you have to create more travel lanes, more turn lanes, more roadways. What Nick mentioned earlier is that typically you lower the bar in urban areas. You expect congestion and traffic problems in your urban areas because they're urban areas and they're not highways. So we're balancing this highway science and we're trying to build communities. So if we were to say we want level of service of D or better in our downtown, we might be putting in a 4-lane road downtown to mitigate, to get that level to where we need to be. So there's a pro and a con to raising the bar. And I don't have a ton of experience in how you navigate that. If you say, well, we might require D or we might not require D, that leaves the staff in kind of a gray area. But it's a great question. And Nick, can you maybe help provide your perspective? Because as staff, we would be relying on Kittleson's judgment on what's an acceptable exception.
Yeah, right. I think you've put it very well, Nathan, with just, what we get into. There's trade-offs with requiring a higher bar, and how realistic is it as background traffic continues to grow and grow and grow. And you run into a situation where, maybe LOSD is what's happening on a Friday PM peak hour. At most places you're going to study in the city anyway, because of just the level of traffic that's already there. So yeah, like you said, it's a double-edged sword. And this, I believe the intent of this is not necessarily refer to it. Once you get to LOSE, then you need to look at safety mitigations. I think if there's a documented safety challenge or a safety concern, that can still be something that's required. This is focused more on mitigations related to traffic operations. I believe that's the intent of this language here, Morgan. I see you nodding, so I think I'm on the right track here. It's related more to traffic delay and congestion, less about safety.
So to clarify, this level of service of D is acceptable based on vehicle delay only. So that level of service D is specifically looking at vehicle delay, not looking at whether the line of sight is safe, not looking at whether the pedestrian facilities are intact. It's really narrowed to that.
So the potential mitigation is just tied to that delay.
Mm-hmm.
And there's another place in here for you to consider safety issues.
Correct. Yep. And again, that kind of is the art of engineering, design, and review and approval. We don't have a specific criteria for every aspect of the human environment, but we specifically do for vehicle traffic delay. And Nick, to help answer that question, are you familiar with any communities that use level of service of D as the threshold for mitigation, as opposed to E, which is what we're proposing? Meaning, it's the terminology. It's like, okay, you have to be below D. So is there any community that you're aware of that says you have to be below C before you mitigate?
It's been a while since I encountered one. They did exist. Whether or not they
In Utah?
The last place I remember encountering was Alaska.
Oh, wow. Okay. Got it.
More of a rural Alaska environment. That's the one I can pull off the top of my head.
Okay.
And there's 2 points. I just want to make sure that in terms of managing time, and they're related to what we're talking about, but go ahead. Please.
Well, I could see it being warranted in a highway design where you're really trying to move traffic efficiently and you don't want delays, because a 30-second delay could cause backups and backups and backups, right? So it would seem like in highway design, maybe level of service D would not be appropriate.
And that's, yes, and that's correct. So for actual, going away from like the traffic impact studies, but for most state DOTs have like a different requirement for if they're building a brand new facility. And then that's different. We're investing in this whole thing. We want to build it with a long design life. So yes, those thresholds are usually lower or higher, depending on your terminology. They're more like the C's or whatever. But yeah.
Julia, does that help provide some perspective? I'm not saying we shouldn't take your recommendation. We'll do whatever the council would like, but how we could get ourselves in a little bit of a gray area if we say, okay, when should we require D? just thinking practically through the process, if we got to the point where the council wasn't happy with what happened in the scoping meeting, we'd have to go back and run that analysis. I don't know if that would be fatal to the land use process.
You know, because ultimately we have multiple stages in the land use process where we can address issues that might be specific to a certain project.
I think what Julia was asking specifically was, could we make it say D or below,
Yeah.
right? Versus below D.
Yeah. Yeah. And so, I mean, you know, I think, you know, you guys have pointed out that it's a little complicated because we have a highway, which you want moving, but it's through town, which is not really a highway. You know, and, you know, what if you are having a development that, I mean, certainly, you know, we wouldn't necessarily, I mean, it might not be proportional to require them to do a 4-lane highway. I think a lot of people wouldn't even want a 4-lane highway through town anyway, but, you know, I mean, it could be a matter of like, well, if it, you know, you can mitigate it going below D by, putting in that turn lane or something like that, you know. I mean, there could be small mitigations that could keep that level of service higher that I wouldn't want to not necessarily consider or be precluded from considering because we said below D. But I get your, you know, it's like all of this. It's all just, it's a case by case situation, and it's all complicated because of, you know, the geographic area you're considering and how big a development is.
To your point, you know, right now we have McCall, the community that it is and that we know, but we've also talked at great lengths about how to enhance Steinhardt and Boyston to be a bypass around town. And your question might be, well, should we change the criteria for that? Because we don't want that to be delayed. So, you know, that might be a perfect example where we want to say we want D or below. Whereas in the downtown core, maybe we're okay with below D because we don't want to have the mitigation be we have to take out buildings and build more lanes just to accommodate traffic, because we'd rather use that space to build more sidewalks. So I don't have a personal recommendation on that. I think from my perspective, I would recommend that we stick with the below D. We engage this discussion in the transportation master plan exercise. And if we come up with some good recommendations on how we could use a below or a D level in certain locations, we could get back to you and study that. I don't think we're prepared at this point to really provide a recommendation, but if you want us to use D as the threshold for mitigation, we'll do it.
I guess one of the things.
I was just saying real quick, I brought that up initially, and I'm comfortable now, Julie, with when you look at the hospital and the school housing, if you put a D requirement on those, as you could get into some, you prevent something, and we're working against local housing. So, but I think we recognize there will be moments when the mitigation, if you give it to them at that meeting, there will be moments when D needs to be mitigated in some reasonable way.
Certainly from a safety perspective. Yeah. And what we also have to be careful of is we can't create exceptions. So if we do it for one development, we have to treat that other development the same way. We can't just say, oh, we're not going to worry about this, because we get ourselves into an inconsistent policy. And then developers will use that and say, you're obligated to give me the same benefit because my development is the same development. This is state code. So, but I think the question is very valid, and I don't know if that wasn't really what we tried to do in this exercise, was to try to look at the community and say, where would a different level of service D be appropriate? That's beyond the scope, but certainly something at the transportation master plan level we could address.
Okay, Lyle, did you have some other observations?
One is and I think of that meeting when we say there's a conflict between what the developer is presenting as their traffic analysis and how we see it, and that we give ourselves the greatest extent of prevailing, I would say, not to turning things into a fight. And so in terms of that prevailing, and there's several things about that. So the mix in the community can change over time. So I think we've seen that we get more truly longer term resident, and that's what we're trying to move. So I think when we say, in that meeting, where we want to be and how we perceive local housing, that we perceive it as greater perhaps in those meetings than the developer does. We should give ourselves the greatest amount of tool. And I have some concern that when we say intended for local housing, that the developer will say, well, this is my intent, and it's below what we think is going to happen over time. So I'm not sure that might tie us into that point you made, Nathan, as we have to treat everybody the same. And that intended for local housing might make it difficult to treat everybody the same on different developments, because one person comes in and says, well, my development's like this. So I'm a little hesitant about that. And I think the idea that typically, if this is a correct statement, so typically across the long range, development does not pay for itself in terms of maintenance of these facilities. And we need to recognize that up front and say across the 10 years of this, in terms of our street maintenance, our street plowing, our pedestrian things, we need to be at the higher level of that. So I'm not sure that intended for local housing might jeopardize that. But here's my another point, and I think we used it really well. I remember when we were doing Jimmy Premier, and we looked at it and we said, does having those extra accesses onto Woolley Avenue fall within the black box? And we asked that question very specifically. And yes, it meets the engineering criteria. And yet we at City Council says, but we don't think it meets the community character and safety. And I just want to remind in future conversations that as these developments come up and that we sitting here can use a judgment factor. It has to have some basis, of course, but safety and community character, we could come back and make a stricter requirement or deny something but it does fit inside the engineering. And Nick alluded to that too. I think that was safe to say, Nick, in your words, that things can fit inside the black box, but this is an art. And we here sit and have the right or the responsibility to apply the art, which means sometimes we need to have a more stringent safety and community character than what the development thinks needs to. That's all.
Yep, I think we all view it that way. So Lyle, are you comfortable moving ahead? Have we had enough discussion on this and questions and answers?
Only if there any discussion on anything to me is in that code of 210 saying intended for local housing. Does that work for us or against us?
To answer your question, I think your direction to staff is when you get in that scoping meeting and we want the expectation of this development to serve local residents, that we need to make sure we use that code appropriately and not use a 70-30. If we say the vision is we want our community to be 50-50, then we should be making that the bar. And this document is not intended to establish that. But I think you're hitting on the point, which is if we're going to approve a subdivision and maybe today it's 70-30, but we want it to be 50-50, and we think it's going to trend that way, then the traffic impact analysis should be 50-50. And I think that opportunity is available for us to do it. This document doesn't restrict us from deciding what that will be. And I think that's some of the guidance you're giving us is like, hey, we need to be thoughtful about the future. If this community is going to change to more of a locals community, then probably our city engineering team needs to use that as the bar. And we've talked with our legal counsel about, hey, there's a follow-up document to this that would be more of that granular prescriptive. These are the expected thresholds that you have to use. Again, our staff's got limited capability. We got to this point. I really would encourage the council to get this approved, and then through the other planning exercises that we have going in the direction you give us, we can come back to you with better tools to refine that.
Okay, then I'll refer back to the previous meeting when we said this, and we all said around the council, our expectation is that scoping meeting, that you come out with the highest traffic count that's justifiable. Mm-hmm. And we're trying to say, we recognize this expense and we're going to have to pay it for a long time. And we want to give you the capacity and the expectation from us that the secondary codes that you still use are justifiable as the highest trip count possible. And so our expectation we're passing on to developers are, we're going to shoot for the highest that's legally and justifiable, because that's the long range probability and that's the cost that we don't want to pick up and put onto our current taxpayers to pay for your development. And that was, pretty universal. So I think that is an expectation that in that scoping meeting, the justification is, how can I justify this at what is truly going to be the long-term impact? And the long-term impact is not, it's significant. I'm sorry. Well, I'm done.
So council, are you ready for me to call for a motion, or is there further questions that you have?
Would it make council more comfortable if we just strike the intended for local residents language?
Can do
Because I
that.
think that wouldn't have a huge impact on our application of things. Because, right, it's not actually the definition, so.
I favor that. And
Yeah.
I'm good to go.
I think so. It's just, I mean, I get it that each application, each development is going to be different and it's going to be a case by case decision. But I mean, it's just because we do have local workforce. I mean, local is a term in other documents we use specifically for certain things. So I think, yeah, just getting rid of that last phrase would be good.
Okay, so I'll make the motion that is going to remove the 4 words in item 6.3 intended for local residents. And the motion to approve resolution 26-4, adopting the transportation impact analysis guidance document, and authorize the mayor to sign all necessary documents.
Second.
Okay, Mike made the motion, and I believe Colby seconded. May I have a roll call vote on that motion?
Councilmember Machezik,
Yes.
Councilmember Nielsen,
Yes.
Mayor Giles,
Yes.
Councilmember Nelson,
Yes.
Councilmember Thrower.
Thank you, everyone. I would suggest we have a 5-minute break, and then we'll get into our second topic.
Nick.
Thanks, Nick.
Hey, thank you. Happy holidays,
That was
everyone.
great. Thanks.